The nurse was hired to take care of a child in a vegetative state. One day, when no one was watching, the nurse approached the child, and what happened next left her terrified. The journey to the Saragossa felt endless. The winding mountain roads, surrounded by thick forests, seemed to pull Sofia deeper into isolation. It was her first time in this region of Brazil, and while the landscape was breathtaking, there was a certain unease about the remoteness of the place. Her thoughts swirled as the taxi climbed higher, each turn revealing glimpses of the sprawling estate she was bound for. It was a job Sofia couldn't refuse, caring for an 8-year-old boy Lucas in a private mansion. The pay was generous, and after years of scraping by in busy hospitals, she hoped this new role would offer stability. Yet, she couldn't shake the apprehension gnawing at her. Finally, the mansion loomed into view. The house was enormous, its dark stone walls stark against the misty gray sky. Tall iron gates creaked open as the car approached, and an elderly woman, dressed in a severe black uniform, waited at the entrance. Her face was etched with deep lines, and her piercing eyes scanned Sofia like a hawk. "You must be Sofia," the woman said, her voice sharp and clipped. "I am Dona Celina, the housekeeper. Follow me. There is much to explain." Sofia barely managed a polite nod as she gathered her suitcase. Inside, the air was cold and still, carrying a faint scent of aged wood and something metallic. The grand foyer was dimly lit, with heavy drapes covering the windows. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of their footsteps on the marble floors. Dona Celina wasted no time. "You were hired to care for Lucas, the boy. You will follow strict rules. Never approach his room without permission, and certainly never enter unless I or Senor Gustavo authorizes it. Understand?" The abruptness caught Sofia off guard. "But I'm his nurse. Shouldn't I?" "You will follow the rules," Dona Celina interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "His condition is delicate. You'll receive further instructions as needed." Sofia bit her tongue, nodding reluctantly. As they moved through the hallways, she noticed security cameras mounted in every corner. The house felt less like a home, and more like a fortress. When they reached Lucas's room, Sofia's heart sank. The door was heavy and locked with an intricate mechanism. Inside, the room was cloaked in shadows. Thick, velvet curtains blocked all sunlight, and the only illumination came from a dim bedside lamp. The boy lay motionless on an ornate bed, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized pillows. His pale face was serene, but his stillness was unnerving. "Lucas is in a vegetative state," Dona Celina explained, her voice softer now but still guarded. "His father insists on privacy. Do your tasks quietly and efficiently." Sofia approached the bed cautiously, her instincts as a nurse compelling her to check his vitals. She noticed his chest rising and falling faintly. Though he was unresponsive, there was something about his presence, an unspoken tension that filled the room. It was as if the air grew heavier the closer she got to him. She turned to ask a question, but Dona Celina had already left. The lock clicked loudly behind her. Alone with Lucas, Sofia felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. This wasn't what she had expected. Hours later, Sofia sat in her modest quarters, replaying the day's events. The staff were few, a cook, a gardener, and Dona Celina, and none were forthcoming with conversation. The isolation of the mansion pressed on her, the silence unnerving. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As Sofia lay in bed that night, trying to shake off her unease, her mind wandered back to Lucas. Why the secrecy? Why the cameras? And most of all, why the forbidding rules? These thoughts swirled in her mind as sleep finally overtook her, but not before she thought she heard something. A faint sound, like scratching, coming from the direction of Lucas's room. The mornings in the mansion began in heavy silence, the kind that pressed against Sofia's ears and seemed to swallow sound. The cook, an older woman named Marta, greeted her with a curt nod when she came down for breakfast, offering no more than a perfunctory "Bon dia." Even the clinking of silverware against porcelain plates felt muffled in the oppressive atmosphere. Sofia's first task was to familiarize herself with Lucas's daily routine. Or rather, what little of it there was. Dona Celina handed her a detailed schedule. Times for feeding, medication, and basic physical therapy to keep his muscles from atrophying. Yet, every instruction came with a reminder: do not linger in his room. Do your work and leave. The sense of being watched was ever present. Sophia could feel the cold gaze of the security cameras tracking her every move, adding to her unease. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on Lucas. But each time she approached his room, her steps grew heavier. Lucas's room was unlike any space Sophia had worked in. The thick velvet curtains never parted, and the air felt stale, almost suffocating. A faint hum came from the medical equipment monitoring his vitals. But even that sound felt muted. Lucas lay in the center of the room, the only island of life in an otherwise lifeless space. She spoke to him softly while working, her instinct as a nurse driving her to provide comfort, even if he couldn't hear her. "Good morning, Lucas," she said one day as she adjusted his intravenous line. "It's a lovely day outside, I think. Not that I can see much through these curtains." She gave a small laugh, though it sounded hollow in the oppressive room. "You're probably tired of my voice already. I'd sing, but I don't think you'd appreciate that." As the days went on, Sophia's curiosity about Lucas's condition grew. She had reviewed his medical records, which painted a clinical picture of his vegetative state. But something felt off. Why was such an elaborate security system necessary? And why the strict rules? She approached Marta one afternoon in the kitchen, hoping to gather some insight. "Lucas," Sophia began hesitantly, "have you known him long?" Marta's hands froze mid-slice, the knife hovering above a carrot. Her eyes darted toward the door before she spoke in a hushed tone. "Long enough," she muttered, resuming her work. "But you'd best not go asking too many questions." "Why not?" Sophia pressed, lowering her voice. Marta sighed, glancing around as if the walls themselves might hear her. "This house has its way of keeping secrets. Just do your job, Menina. It's safer that way." The words sent a shiver down Sophia's spine. She wanted to push further, but Marta's stiff posture made it clear the conversation was over. One evening, as Sophia prepared Lucas for his nightly medications, a flicker on the security monitor caught her eye. The small screen in the corner of his room displayed various angles of the house, including the front gates, hallways, and even the gardens. A shadow darted across one of the feeds, a quick, almost imperceptible movement. She blinked, staring at the screen. But when she looked again, there was nothing. "Must be the wind," she muttered to herself, though her voice wavered. She finished her work quickly, her nerves on edge. That night, as Sophia lay in her bed, she struggled to sleep. The image of the shadow on the monitor played over and over in her mind. The wind outside whistled through the trees, and she could have sworn she heard faint footsteps in the hallway. She sat up, holding her breath, straining to hear more. Nothing. Sophia told herself it was her imagination. This house, with its oppressive quiet and unsettling rules, was getting to her. She forced herself to lie back down, but sleep came in fits and starts. By the fourth day, Sophia could no longer ignore the peculiarities of the mansion. Lucas's father, Signor Gustavo, had yet to make an appearance. She had only seen him briefly on her first day, a tall, stern man who spoke little before disappearing into his study. His absence felt like a ghost lingering over the house. Sophia decided to explore the house during her break, driven by a mixture of boredom and a gnawing sense of unease. The hallways were lined with old portraits, their painted eyes seeming to follow her. She paused before one painting, a woman with dark curls and a gentle smile, her hand resting on a boy's shoulder. The boy's face was eerily familiar. Lucas. Before she could study it further, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She turned sharply to see Donna Selena, her face as stern as ever. "What are you doing?" Selena's voice was sharp. Sophia hesitated, feeling like a child caught sneaking a cookie. "I was just looking at the portraits." "Is this Lucas and his mother?" Donna Selena's expression darkened. "That is Signora Carolina, may she rest in peace. And I suggest you keep your curiosity to yourself, Sophia. This is not your concern." Sophia nodded, though the encounter left her with more questions than answers. She returned to her room, her mind racing. Something about this house, about Lucas, didn't add up. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, a soft sound jolted her awake. It was faint but unmistakable, a rhythmic scratching noise coming from the direction of Lucas's room. Her breath hitched. Grabbing a flashlight, she stepped into the dark hallway. Her heart pounded as she approached his door. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate. She reached for the handle but froze. The warning from Donna Selena echoing in her mind. Never enter without permission. Sophia leaned her ear against the door, the sound sending chills down her spine. It was coming from inside. The scratching sound haunted Sophia long after it had stopped. For the rest of the night, she remained awake in her bed, straining to hear anything else. But the house had returned to its usual oppressive silence. When dawn broke, she was exhausted but determined to make sense of what she'd experienced. That morning, Sophia's duties carried on as usual. She tended to Lucas, speaking to him softly as she adjusted his medications and checked his vitals. His unchanging expression gave no hint that he'd ever been anything but a silent observer of the world around him. "Good morning, Lucas," she said gently. "Did you sleep well?" She laughed at her own words. The awkwardness of addressing someone who couldn't respond evident in her tone. Yet it felt important to keep trying, as if her words might reach him somehow. As she repositioned him slightly to prevent bedsores, Sophia's eyes wandered to his hands. His nails were short, trimmed to avoid accidental scratches, but faint marks on his palms caught her attention. They looked like abrasions, small and recent. A cold wave of realization swept over her. Could Lucas have made the scratches she heard last night? It was impossible, or at least it should have been. But the marks on his hands told another story. She checked his restraints, which were loose enough to avoid discomfort, but secure enough to prevent movement. Everything seemed in order, yet the doubt lingered. The mansion's staff offered no solace. At breakfast, Sophia attempted to bring up her concerns in the kitchen. "Marta," Sophia began hesitantly, stirring her coffee, "have you ever heard strange noises at night?" The cook stiffened, her knife pausing mid-chop. She didn't look up as she spoke. "You'd do well not to go listening to things that don't concern you. It's just..." Sophia hesitated. "I think I heard something coming from Lucas's room. Maybe an animal got in." Marta's gaze flicked to Sophia, sharp and wary. "This is an old house. It makes noises, creaks in the night. That's all." Sophia opened her mouth to argue, but the cook's expression left no room for debate. Instead, she finished her coffee in silence, her mind spinning. That evening, after another long day of tending to Lucas, Sophia found herself in his room once more. The curtains remained closed, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. She moved to his bedside to adjust his pillow, her gaze lingering on his face. He looked peaceful, almost angelic. Yet there was something unsettling about his stillness, like a doll perfectly posed in a lifelike imitation of rest. Sophia shook her head, scolding herself for letting her imagination run wild. Just as she turned to leave, her foot caught on something near the bed. She knelt to investigate, and found deep scratches in the wooden floor. They were faint but deliberate, long lines etched into the surface beneath Lucas's bed. Her heart raced. She stared at the marks, her mind battling between rational explanations and the creeping sense that something was profoundly wrong. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. The events of the day replayed in her mind. Lucas's unblemished nails, the scratches on the floor, and the faint marks on his hands. None of it added up. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a new sound broke the silence. This time it wasn't scratching. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a low rhythmic thudding. Sophia froze, her breath caught in her throat. The noise seemed to come from above, from Lucas's room. She grabbed her flashlight again and slipped out into the hallway, her steps as quiet as she could manage. The air felt colder as she approached his door. The thudding continued, a steady beat that sent chills through her. Sophia placed her hand on the doorknob but hesitated, the warning from Donna Selena replaying in her mind. Her curiosity won. She twisted the knob, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The door creaked open, and Sophia stepped inside. The room was as she'd left it earlier, dimly lit and oppressively quiet. Lucas lay on the bed as still as ever. The thudding had stopped. Sophia's eyes scanned the room, her flashlight beam darting over the walls and furniture. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of being watched prickled at her skin. She stepped closer to the bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Lucas," she whispered, though she didn't know why. "Are you?" The sound of movement behind her froze her mid-sentence. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The shadows seemed to shift, but Sophia couldn't tell if it was her imagination or something more sinister. She backed toward the door, her heart pounding. As she reached for the handle, a sudden cold gust swept through the room, extinguishing the flashlight's beam. Sophia gasped, fumbling with the device. It flickered back on, illuminating Lucas's face. His eyes were open. For a brief moment, Sophia thought she saw him blink. But as she stared, the blank, lifeless gaze remained unchanging. She stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind her, and raced back to her quarters, her mind reeling. The next morning, Sophia found herself face to face with Donna Selena. The older woman's expression was colder than usual. "You entered his room last night," Selena said without preamble. It wasn't a question. Sophia's stomach dropped. I thought I heard something. I was just checking." "Never enter without permission," Selena snapped, her tone sharp as a blade. "Do you understand me?" Sophia nodded, too shaken to argue. But as she returned to her duties that day, one question burned in her mind. Had she imagined it? Or was Lucas trying to tell her something? The encounter in Lucas's room haunted Sophia for days. Her rational mind wrestled with what she had seen, or thought she had seen. His eyes couldn't have opened. It was impossible. Yet the memory of that blank, unblinking stare refused to fade. Determined to make sense of it all, Sophia resolved to keep her guard up while staying alert for anything unusual. Her instincts told her that the answer lay within Lucas's room, no matter what Donna Selena insisted. It was during a routine cleaning that Sophia discovered the first clue. Donna Selena had assigned her to dust the corners of Lucas's room, something that wasn't part of her usual duties. Sophia suspected it was Selena's way of asserting control after her disobedience. Still, she welcomed the opportunity to explore the room more closely. The heavy curtains remained drawn, casting the room in a perpetual twilight. Sophia worked methodically, her movements slow and deliberate as she scanned every inch of the space. She dusted the shelves, the ornate dresser, and even the carved bed frame, careful not to disturb Lucas as he lay motionless. When she moved to adjust the bedding, her hand brushed against something beneath the mattress. Her pulse quickened as she lifted the corner of the blanket, her fingers searching the space. Her fingertips grazed the edge of a book, a thin leather-bound journal wedged between the mattress and the bed frame. Sophia glanced toward the door, ensuring she was alone, before pulling the journal free. The cover was unmarked, the leather worn from years of handling. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The first page was filled with neat handwriting, signed by someone named Carolina. A chill swept through Sophia. She flipped through the pages, skimming their contents. They were filled with entries written in Portuguese, recounting moments of happiness, frustration, and fear. It was Lucas's mother. Sophia couldn't resist bringing the journal to her quarters to read in secret. Late that night, under the dim light of a single lamp, she delved into Carolina's words. The early entries were mundane, detailing life at the mansion and Lucas's early childhood. Carolina described him as a curious, energetic boy with an infectious laugh. There were notes about his love for drawing, and the way he would wake her early every morning to show her his latest creation. But as Sophia turned the pages, the tone shifted. Carolina began mentioning strange occurrences in the house, sounds she couldn't explain, objects moving from their places, and shadows she caught out of the corner of her eye. One entry stopped Sophia cold. Asterisk, I hear it at night, the scratching at the walls. I thought it was my imagination, but Lucas says he hears it too. He told me he's seen the shadow. At first I dismissed it as a child's fancy, but now, I'm not so sure. Asterisk, Sophia's breath caught. The shadow? It couldn't be a coincidence. She continued reading, her hands trembling. Asterisk, Gustavo insists I'm imagining things, but I know what I saw. Last night, the shadow was in Lucas's room. It stood by his bed watching him. When I approached, it vanished. Lucas woke up screaming. I've never heard him cry like that before. There's something wrong in this house, something dark. And I fear it's taken an interest in my son. Asterisk, Sophia closed the journal, her heart racing. The entries painted a picture of a woman unraveling under the weight of fear, her growing paranoia dismissed by those around her. Her final entry was the most chilling. Asterisk, if anything happens to me, promise me you'll protect Lucas. He's innocent. He doesn't deserve this. Asterisk, the following day, Sophia approached Lucas's room with new eyes. As she adjusted his bedding and tended to his medications, she studied his face, searching for any hint of awareness. If Carolina had seen something sinister in the house, could it still be here? Could it be the cause of Lucas's condition? Lucas, she whispered, her voice barely audible. If you can hear me, I promise I'll figure this out. I won't let anything happen to you. She didn't expect a response, but the act of speaking her promise out loud brought her a measure of resolve. She would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. That evening, Sophia confronted Donna Selena. Tell me about Lucas's mother, Sophia demanded, her voice firm. Carolina. Selena's eyes narrowed. You've overstepped, Sophia. It's none of your concern. It is my concern, Sophia shot back. I found her journal. She wrote about things happening in this house, things that terrified her. If Lucas is in danger, I need to know. The older woman's expression faltered, but only for a moment. You're playing with fire, Menina, Selena warned. Leave it alone. I can't, Sophia said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Lucas deserves better than this. If you care about him at all, tell me what's going on. For a moment, Selena looked as though she might give in. But then her face hardened, and she turned away. Do your job, Sophia, she said coldly. That's all you need to know. That night, Sophia returned to her quarters with more questions than answers. Carolina's journal had deepened the mystery, but it also gave her a purpose. Whatever was haunting this house, whatever had stolen Lucas's life, she would face it. As she lay in bed, sleep refused to come. The journal's final words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, protect Lucas. He doesn't deserve this. Asterisk, then, just as she began to drift off, the scratching started again. The scratching persisted through the night, growing louder and more deliberate. Sophia lay frozen in her bed, clutching the journal to her chest. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very walls of the mansion were alive. Gathering her courage, she grabbed her flashlight and ventured into the hall. The oppressive silence of the house magnified her every step. As she approached Lucas's door, the sound abruptly stopped. She paused, straining to hear anything further, but all that greeted her was the eerie stillness. Sophia pressed her ear to the door but dared not open it. Not tonight. The next morning, the mansion was abuzz with unexpected activity. The staff moved with a nervous urgency, polishing surfaces, arranging flowers, and preparing an elaborate meal. Sophia found Marta in the kitchen, kneading dough with frantic energy. What's going on? Sophia asked. Marta glanced at her, her face pale. Señor Gustavo is returning today. Sophia's stomach churned. She had barely seen Lucas's father since her arrival, and the few impressions she had gathered were unsettling. Gustavo's distant nature and cryptic remarks about the price they paid lingered in her memory. When will he be here? Sophia pressed. By this afternoon, Marta replied, lowering her voice. I suggest you tread carefully around him, Menina. He's not a man to cross. The hours passed in a haze of anticipation and dread. Shortly after lunch, the sound of a car engine announced Gustavo's arrival. Sophia stood at the edge of the grand foyer as the front doors swung open. Gustavo stepped inside, his presence commanding even in the quiet. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his hair slicked back. His eyes, a cold gray, swept over the room before landing on Sophia. His expression revealed no warmth, only a vague curiosity. So you're the new nurse, he said, his deep voice reverberating through the space. Yes, senor, Sophia replied, keeping her tone professional. Gustavo studied her for a moment before nodding. Good. I expect competence. My son's care is your sole priority. He turned to Donna Selena, who stood at his side. I'll see Lucas now. Of course, senor, Selena said, her voice deferential. Sophia hesitated, unsure whether to follow. Gustavo seemed to sense her hesitation and fixed her with a sharp gaze. Come. You should be present. In Lucas's room, the air felt heavier than usual. Gustavo approached the bed with a measured step, his eyes scanning his son's still form. For a moment his expression softened, but it was fleeting. "Lucas," he said, his voice low. "You look well." Sophia stood at the foot of the bed, unsure how to respond. Gustavo didn't seem to expect one. Instead, he turned to her. "Have you noticed anything unusual about his condition?" he asked abruptly. Sophia hesitated. She thought of the scratching sounds, the strange marks on the floor, and Lucas's open eyes that night. But something about Gustavo's demeanor made her wary. "No, senor," she lied. "He seems stable." Gustavo's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Keep it that way." As he turned to leave, Sophia mustered her courage. "Senor Gustavo," she began, "I read Carolina's journal. She wrote about strange occurrences in this house. Do you know what she meant?" Gustavo froze, his back to her. For a moment, the room was suffocatingly silent. Then he turned, his face a mask of controlled anger. "You should not have done that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Carolina's thoughts were her own. They have nothing to do with you." "But Lucas, enough." His tone left no room for argument. "Do your job and leave the past buried." Gustavo stormed out, leaving Sophia shaken. Selena, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, gave Sophia a pointed look. "Let this be the last time you bring up Carolina," Selena warned. "For your own good." That night, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she had touched a nerve. Gustavo's reaction had been too severe, his anger too immediate. Carolina's journal had hinted at dark truths, and Gustavo clearly wanted them hidden. Sophia decided she needed answers, but she would have to tread carefully. Gustavo was not a man to underestimate. As she lay in bed, pondering her next move, the scratching returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent, as if demanding her attention. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sophia grabbed her flashlight and crept into the hallway. This time, she wouldn't stop at the door. This time she would find the truth. Sophia pushed open the door to Lucas's room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The scratching continued, seeming to echo from the walls themselves. She scanned the room, her beam cutting through the gloom. The marks on the floor near Lucas's bed had multiplied, deep grooves etched into the wood. Her heart raced as she approached the bed. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice shaking. "If you're trying to tell me something, I'm listening." The scratching stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Sophia's breath came in short gasps as she stared at Lucas. Then slowly his hand twitched. It was barely perceptible, but it was enough. "Lucas," she gasped. His eyes remained closed, his body still. But Sophia was certain she had seen it. His fingers had moved. Her shock turned to determination. Whatever was happening to Lucas, whatever secrets this house held, she would uncover them. And she would not stop until she did. Sophia's determination grew sharper with each passing day, fueled by the memory of Lucas's subtle movement and the ominous scratching sounds. She was sure now that something, or someone, was trying to communicate with her. Whether it was Lucas, or the sinister force Carolina had written about, Sophia couldn't be certain. But she knew she couldn't remain passive any longer. Her opportunity came one evening when she overheard Gustavo and Dona Selena arguing in the study. Their voices, muffled but unmistakably heated, drifted through the closed door as Sophia passed by. "This cannot continue," Gustavo hissed, his words sharp. "We have paid the price already. Lucas is the proof of that." Selena's response was equally tense though quieter. "The balance is delicate, senor. Interference could." "I don't care about balance," Gustavo snapped. "I care about control." "She's asking too many questions." Sophia froze, her heart pounding. She strained to hear more, but the conversation had dropped to hushed tones. Not wanting to be caught, she retreated to her room, her thoughts racing. Asterisk, we have paid the price. Asterisk, what price? And why was Lucas part of it? Later that night, Sophia decided to act. She waited until the house was dark and still, then crept back to Lucas's room. If answers weren't going to come from Gustavo or Selena, she would find them herself. The air in Lucas's room felt colder than usual, the shadows deeper. Sophia's flashlight revealed the now familiar scratches on the floor, but something about them seemed different. They were sharper, fresher, as though they had been made recently. "Lucas," she whispered, approaching the bed. "I'm here. I know something's wrong. Please give me a sign. She reached out and hesitated, then placed her hand gently over his. The instant her skin touched his, a jolt of energy shot through her arm, freezing her in place. Her vision blurred, and the room seemed to vanish. Sophia found herself standing in a dimly lit space, unfamiliar yet somehow deeply tied to the mansion. The walls were lined with old flickering candles, their weak flames casting long dancing shadows. In the center of the room was a figure, a woman, her back turned to Sophia. She was weeping softly. Carolina, Sophia's voice echoed, though she wasn't sure if she had spoken aloud. The figure turned, and Sophia's breath caught. It was Carolina, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with sorrow. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed to the far corner of the room. Sophia turned to look, and her blood ran cold. A shadowy figure loomed there, its form shifting and unnatural, as though it were made of smoke and malice. Its eyes glowed a deep, unsettling red, and Sophia felt its gaze pierce through her. Help him, Carolina's voice whispered, distant and ghostly. Save my son. Before Sophia could move, the shadow surged toward her. A scream caught in her throat as she was ripped back into reality. She woke on the floor of Lucas's room, her body trembling. Her hands still tingled from the shock of touching Lucas, and her head throbbed with pain. Lucas lay as still as ever, his expression unchanged. But the scratches on the floor had grown. The marks now formed a crude, jagged shape, a circle with lines slashing through it. Sophia recognized it from Carolina's journal. It was the same symbol Carolina had drawn repeatedly in her later entries. Sophia stumbled out of the room, clutching her chest. She needed answers, and this time, she would confront Gustavo directly. The next morning, Sophia found Gustavo in the study, his face grim as he pored over papers. He didn't look up as she entered, but his voice was sharp. You're not allowed in here. I don't care, Sophia said, surprising herself with her boldness. I need to know the truth. What happened to Lucas? What is that thing in this house? Gustavo's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing dangerously. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough, Sophia countered. I've seen Carolina's journal. I've seen something. Lucas isn't just in a vegetative state, is he? Something's holding him there. Gustavo's expression shifted, a flicker of something between anger and fear crossing his face. You don't understand, he said finally, his voice low. You think you can fix this? You think you can help my son? Tell me, Sophia demanded. What did you do? Gustavo rose from his chair, towering over her. For a moment, Sophia thought he might strike her, but instead he turned away, his shoulders slumping. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We were desperate. The business was failing. The mansion, everything was falling apart. Carolina begged me not to go through with it, but He trailed off, his hands trembling. You did what? Sophia pressed, her heart racing. A ritual, Gustavo admitted, his voice hollow. An old rite passed down through the family. It promised success, wealth, stability, but it required a sacrifice. I thought it would take something small, something we could afford to lose. He turned to Sophia, his eyes haunted. But it didn't. It took Lucas. And now, that thing won't let him go. Sophia's knees nearly gave out. She clutched the back of a chair for support, her mind reeling. You let this happen, she said, her voice trembling with anger. You traded your son's life for money. I didn't know, Gustavo shot back, his voice cracking. I didn't understand the cost until it was too late. Carolina tried to stop it, but... He paused, his face darkening. She paid her own price. And now Lucas is trapped, and so are we. Sophia's resolve hardened. There has to be a way to free him. Gustavo shook his head. I've tried. There's no way out. The more you fight it, the worse it gets. Then I'll find a way, Sophia said, her voice fierce. I won't let Lucas suffer for your mistakes. That night, as Sophia lay in bed, the mansion seemed to close in around her. The scratching began again, louder than ever. But this time she didn't flinch. She stared into the darkness, her mind made up. She would save Lucas, no matter the cost. The air in the mansion was thick with tension. After her conversation with Gustavo, Sophia knew she was on borrowed time. Whatever bargain Gustavo had struck, and whatever darkness had taken hold of Lucas, It was clear that the staff, especially Donna Selena, were complicit. If Sophia was going to save Lucas, she needed answers. And there was only one person left to confront. Sophia found Donna Selena in the parlor, meticulously dusting the edges of a cabinet. The older woman looked up as Sophia entered, her sharp gaze immediately narrowing. "You're pushing boundaries, Menina," Selena said without preamble. "Whatever it is you think you're doing, you should stop." "No," Sophia replied firmly, stepping closer. "I won't stop. Not until I know the truth about Lucas. About this house. About you." Selena's hand froze mid-swipe, her grip tightening on the dust cloth. "I warned you to leave well enough alone. And I ignored you," Sophia said, her voice steady. "Lucas isn't just sick. Something is holding him here. Something you know about." Selena's expression darkened. But there was a flicker of something else, fear. She set the dust cloth down, her movements deliberate. "You don't understand what you're meddling with," Selena said, her voice quieter now. "This is bigger than you or me." "Then help me understand," Sophia pressed. "If you care about Lucas, if you care about Carolina, then stop hiding the truth." The mention of Carolina's name made Selena flinch. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Sophia thought she might refuse. But then, with a heavy sigh, Selena gestured for her to sit. "The truth," Selena began, "is that this family has been cursed for generations. Gustavo's family name carries weight, wealth, and influence. But none of it comes without a price." Sophia leaned forward, her heart pounding. "The ritual," she said. "Gustavo told me about it. What does it have to do with Lucas?" Selena's face was grim. "The ritual isn't just an old family tradition. It's a pact. A bargain struck long ago with a force that thrives on human despair and suffering. Each generation is expected to offer something in return for the family's prosperity. And Lucas was the price." Sophia's voice cracked with anger. Selena nodded, her expression heavy with regret. "Gustavo was desperate. He thought he could cheat the ritual, offering only a token sacrifice. But that thing, the shadow, it isn't so easily fooled. It claimed Lucas, binding him to this house. Carolina tried to stop it, but by then it was too late." "Carolina's journal mentioned the shadow," Sophia said, her voice trembling. "She saw it. She said it stood by Lucas's bed." Selena's eyes darted to the window, as if the very mention of the shadow might summon it. She was right. The shadow is the keeper of the pact. It ensures the price is paid in full. And Lucas, he's its prisoner now. Sophia's stomach churned. There has to be a way to free him. What about an exorcism? Selena shook her head. "We've tried. Priests have come and gone, but none of them could banish it. The shadow is bound to the family, to the house itself. It won't leave without taking something in return. Then I'll find someone who can," Sophia said, her determination blazing. Selena's gaze softened, and for the first time, she looked almost sad. "You have a good heart, Menina, but you don't know what you're up against. The shadow will fight to keep what it's claimed. And if you go against it, it will claim you too." Sophia stood, her resolve unshaken. "I won't let Lucas suffer for Gustavo's mistakes. If there's even a chance I can save him, I'll take it." Selena rose as well, her expression unreadable. "Then God help you," she said quietly. "Because once you start this fight, there's no turning back." That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. The mansion's oppressive silence felt heavier than ever. The shadows in her room darker and more menacing. She clutched Carolina's journal to her chest, its pages now a source of guidance and hope. The entry about the shadow replayed in her mind. Asterisk, it wants Lucas. It won't let him go. But there's a way to weaken it. The bond isn't unbreakable. It can be severed. Asterisk, Sophia flipped to the page, her fingers trembling. Carolina had described an object, an old relic hidden somewhere in the house. It was part of the original ritual, a symbol of the family's pact. Destroying it, Carolina believed, might weaken the shadow's hold. Sophia knew what she had to do. She needed to find the relic. The mansion's labyrinthine halls felt more oppressive than ever as Sophia began her search. Each creak of the floorboards and flicker of the dim lighting sent shivers down her spine. The staff had retired for the night, leaving her alone to explore. She started in the study, rifling through drawers and cabinets, while keeping one ear tuned for any sounds. She found ledgers, documents, and photographs, but nothing resembling the relic Carolina had described. Her search brought her to the attic, a dusty, cluttered space filled with forgotten relics of the family's past. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Sophia's flashlight cut through the gloom as she sifted through boxes and trunks. At last, in an old wooden chest, she found it. A small, ornate box. Its lid engraved with the same jagged symbol carved into Lucas's floor. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing a blackened amulet inside. The object pulsed faintly, as though it were alive. As Sophia reached for it, a cold wind swept through the attic, extinguishing her flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and a low guttural growl filled the air. The shadow had found her. The growl reverberated through the attic, a deep guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sophia froze, the ornate box in her trembling hands. The amulet inside pulsed faintly, its eerie glow casting faint shadows across her face. She turned slowly, her flashlight useless in the oppressive darkness. The shadow had taken form, a shifting, amorphous entity that seemed to devour the dim light around it. Its glowing red eyes pierced the gloom, fixing on her with an intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed for her to run, but she couldn't leave without the amulet. Summoning every ounce of courage, she grabbed the artifact and shoved it into her pocket. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils reaching out like claws. Sophia ducked, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and scrambled toward the attic stairs. The air grew colder with each passing second, and her chest ached as though the darkness itself was trying to suffocate her. As she reached the stairs, the shadow let out a deafening roar, a sound so primal it rattled her bones. Sophia didn't look back. She clutched the banister and fled down the creaking steps, the amulet burning cold against her skin. She burst into her room, slamming the door behind her. Her chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath. The shadow hadn't followed her, at least not physically. But the air in the mansion felt heavier, more oppressive, as though the entity was watching her from every corner. Sophia retrieved the amulet from her pocket, her hands shaking. It was heavier than it looked, its surface etched with the same jagged symbol she'd seen carved into the floor of Lucas's room. She placed it on the small table beside her bed, and opened Carolina's journal, flipping to the entry that had led her to the attic. "The relic binds the shadow to this house," Carolina had written. Asterisk, "it holds its power, its essence. Destroy it, and the bond will weaken. But beware, the shadow will fight to protect it." Asterisk, Sophia glanced at the amulet, its faint glow casting eerie patterns on the walls. Destroying it would weaken the shadow's hold, but she needed to act carefully. If Carolina's warnings were true, the shadow wouldn't let her succeed without a fight. The next morning, Sophia awoke to the sound of voices outside her door. She opened it a crack to find Gustavo and Dona Selena in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones. "You said the relic was safe," Gustavo hissed, his face pale. "If she found it, I don't know how she did," Selena replied, her voice sharp with frustration. "I've warned her to stop digging, but she won't listen." Sophia's stomach churned. They knew. Her time was running out. She spent the day avoiding Gustavo and Selena, her mind racing. She couldn't destroy the amulet here. The shadow was too strong. But leaving the mansion wasn't an option. The bond between Lucas and the shadow was tied to this place, and severing it required the artifact to be destroyed on the grounds. Sophia decided to wait until nightfall. Under cover of darkness, she would take the amulet to the garden, far from Lucas's room, and destroy it. The thought filled her with both hope and dread. Hope that Lucas might finally be free, and dread of what the shadow might do to stop her. As night fell, Sophia prepared for the task. She wrapped the amulet in a cloth, stuffed it into her bag, and grabbed a heavy stone from the garden to use as a hammer. Her heart pounded as she stepped out into the cold night air, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The garden was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of her footsteps on the gravel path. Sophia chose a spot near the edge of the grounds, where an old stone bench sat beneath a twisted oak tree. She placed the amulet on the ground and unwrapped it, its faint glow illuminating the gnarled roots. "Here goes nothing," she whispered, raising the stone. Before she could strike, a deafening roar shattered the silence. The shadow erupted from the darkness, its form towering and monstrous, its glowing eyes filled with rage. It surged toward her, and Sophia barely had time to dodge as its tendrils lashed out. "You won't stop me," she shouted, gripping the stone tightly. The shadow let out a guttural growl, its movements faster now, more frantic. Sophia swung the stone down, striking the amulet. A crack echoed through the garden as the artifact splintered, its glow dimming. The shadow howled, a sound of pure agony, and recoiled. Sophia raised the stone again, her hands trembling, and brought it down with all her strength. The amulet shattered into fragments, and an ear-splitting scream ripped through the air. The shadow writhed, its form flickering and unstable. It lashed out one final time, knocking Sophia backward. She hit the ground hard, her vision swimming, as the entity dissolved into a haze of smoke and faded into the night. When Sophia regained consciousness, the garden was still. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over the mansion gone. She scrambled to her feet, her gaze darting around. The shadow was gone, but she didn't feel victorious, not yet. She needed to see Lucas. Sophia raced back to the mansion, her legs aching as she climbed the stairs to Lucas's room. She burst through the door, her breath catching in her throat. Lucas was moving. His eyes fluttered open, their hazel depths filled with confusion and fear. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Sophia. His lips parted, and a hoarse whisper escaped. "Help me." Tears streamed down Sophia's face. "I will," she promised, her voice trembling. "You're free now, Lucas. I promise I'll help you." Lucas's whispered plea echoed in Sophia's mind as she stood by his bedside, her heart hammering in her chest. He was awake, but frail and disoriented, his voice barely audible. Sophia knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she adjusted the oxygen mask on his face. "You're safe now, Lucas," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure if it was true. Lucas's lips moved again, his voice weak and broken. "The shadows still watching." Her blood ran cold. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see the amorphous shape lurking in the corners. But the room remained still, eerily quiet. The shattered amulet had weakened the shadow, but Sophia feared it wasn't entirely gone. The next morning, the house erupted in chaos. Gustavo stormed into Lucas's room, his face pale with anger and disbelief. When he saw Lucas sitting up in bed, supported by pillows, his expression softened into one of astonishment. "Lucas," he whispered, his voice cracking. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out hesitantly, as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. Lucas's gaze flickered toward his father. His lips moved again, but no sound came out. Sophia intervened, stepping between them. "He needs rest," she said firmly. "This isn't a miracle, Gustavo. He's still weak, and I don't think we're out of danger yet." "Danger?" Gustavo's eyes narrowed. "What have you done, Sophia?" "I did what you should have done," Sophia snapped. "I destroyed the relic. It was the source of the shadow's power. Without it, Lucas had a chance to wake up." Gustavo's face darkened. "You fool," he hissed. "You don't understand the consequences of your actions. The shadow doesn't just disappear. It will demand a new price." Sophia's stomach tightened. She had suspected as much, but she wasn't about to let fear paralyze her. "Then we'll face it," she said, her voice resolute. "Lucas doesn't deserve to suffer because of your mistakes." As the day wore on, Sophia stayed by Lucas's side, monitoring his vitals and coaxing him to take small sips of water. He was too weak to speak more than a few words, but his eyes, filled with gratitude and fear, spoke volumes. Meanwhile, Gustavo retreated to his study, and Dona Selena avoided Sophia entirely. The air in the mansion felt different now, lighter, less oppressive, but Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. That night, Sophia made her decision. She couldn't leave Lucas in this house, under the care of a father who valued wealth over his own son's life. If the shadow returned, it would demand another sacrifice, and Sophia refused to let Lucas be its target again. She would take him away. Under the cover of darkness, Sophia prepared for their escape. She packed a small bag with Lucas's medication, a change of clothes, and a flashlight. Every sound in the house made her flinch, her ears straining for signs of movement. Lucas watched her from the bed, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Where Are we going? He rasped. Someplace safe, Sophia whispered. I won't let them hurt you again, Lucas. You have to trust me. His tiny hand reached for hers, and she felt a surge of resolve. Sophia's plan was simple. Take Lucas to the village below the mansion and find a priest who could perform a proper exorcism. She had read enough in Carolina's journal to believe that the shadow's bond to Lucas could still be broken completely. But she couldn't do it alone. As she wheeled Lucas's gurney toward the door, the house seemed to wake. The lights flickered, and the floorboards groaned beneath her feet. The air grew colder, and Sophia's breath misted in front of her. Stay calm, she told Lucas, though her own heart was pounding. The moment she stepped into the hallway, a low growl echoed through the mansion. The shadow was back. It surged toward them, its form darker and more menacing than before. Sophia gripped the handles of the gurney tightly, her mind racing. You can't have him, she shouted, her voice shaking with anger and fear. The shadow paused, as if considering her words. Then it lunged, its tendrils reaching for Lucas. Sophia pushed the gurney forward with all her strength, racing down the hall as the entity pursued them. The house seemed to twist and shift around her, the walls narrowing and the doors slamming shut as if trying to trap her. Sophia swerved into the kitchen, grabbing a salt shaker from the counter. She flung the contents at the shadow, and it recoiled with a deafening screech. She didn't stop to see if it would recover. With Lucas barely clinging to consciousness, Sophia pushed forward, heading for the front door. When they finally burst into the cold night air, Sophia felt a fleeting sense of relief. The shadow hesitated at the threshold, its form flickering as if bound to the mansion. But as Sophia turned to look, it began to push forward, its tendrils inching into the open air. The village lights twinkled far below, a beacon of hope in the distance. Sophia gritted her teeth, her determination renewed. We're almost there, Lucas, she whispered. Hold on. The cold night wind bit at Sophia's skin as she pushed Lucas's gurney down the gravel driveway. Behind them, the shadow oozed out of the mansion's doorway, its tendrils clawing at the ground as it pursued them. The village lights below the hill seemed impossibly far away, but Sophia refused to stop. Just a little farther, she whispered, though her words were as much for herself as for Lucas. Lucas stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open. It's here, he rasped, his voice barely audible. I know, Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the terror twisting in her chest. I won't let it take you. The shadow moved faster, its amorphous body undulating like a living storm. Its growls reverberated through the trees, shaking the very ground. Sophia felt the air grow heavier with every step, as though the shadow was trying to drag her back into the mansion's grip. The narrow path to the village twisted through the woods, its uneven surface making the gurney difficult to maneuver. Sophia's muscles ached as she fought to keep it steady, her eyes darting between the path ahead and the monstrosity behind. The trees around them seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching down like skeletal hands. The shadow surged forward, its glowing red eyes burning brighter. You won't have him, Sophia screamed, grabbing a handful of salt from her pocket and throwing it at the entity. The shadow recoiled, shrieking in pain, but it didn't retreat. If anything, it seemed angrier, its movements more erratic as it closed the distance between them. The village church came into view at last, its bell tower rising above the cluster of dimly lit buildings. Sophia's breath hitched in relief. She pushed Lucas forward with renewed vigor, her legs burning with effort. As they reached the church steps, the shadow struck. Its tendrils lashed out, wrapping around the wheels of the gurney and pulling it backward. Sophia screamed, throwing herself against the gurney to keep it from toppling. Lucas cried out weakly, his voice tinged with panic. Help me. Sophia grabbed a rosary from her pocket, a small token she'd taken from the mansion's chapel, and held it aloft. In the name of God, leave him alone, she shouted. The shadow hissed, its form flickering as though the holy object had weakened it. Taking advantage of the moment, Sophia pushed the gurney up the steps and through the heavy church doors. Inside, the church was dimly lit, its pews empty and its air heavy with the scent of incense. The priest, a wiry man with kind eyes, appeared from the sanctuary, his face twisting in alarm at the sight of Sophia and Lucas. Padre, por favor, Sophia cried, I need your help. It's after him. The priest's eyes widened as the shadow slammed against the church doors, its monstrous form writhing against the barrier. The wood groaned under the pressure, but the entity couldn't enter. Bring him to the altar, the priest said quickly, moving to retrieve a vial of holy water and a thick, leather-bound Bible. Sophia wheeled Lucas to the front of the church, her hands trembling. The priest began to pray, his voice steady and commanding despite the shadow's deafening roars outside. As the priest sprinkled holy water over Lucas and recited verses in Latin, the church shook. The shadow clawed at the windows, its tendrils seeping through the cracks and creeping toward the altar. The air grew colder, and Sophia's breath came out in visible puffs. Keep praying, Sophia shouted, grabbing a nearby candlestick and using it to block the shadow's advance. The priest's voice rose, his prayers echoing through the church. The holy water seemed to burn the shadow, forcing it to recoil, but its fury only grew. It lashed out, sending pews crashing and shattering stained glass windows. Lucas's body convulsed, his back arching as he gasped for air. His eyes flew open wide with terror. It's inside me, he screamed, his voice stronger than before. No, Lucas, Sophia cried, gripping his hand tightly. You're stronger than it is. Fight it. The priest grabbed Sophia's shoulder. Hold him steady, he commanded, raising the Bible high. This will be the final test. As the priest recited the last verse of the exorcism, the shadow let out an ear-splitting screech. Its form writhed violently, shrinking and expanding as though being torn apart. Lucas's body went rigid, his face contorted in pain. Lucas, stay with me, Sophia sobbed, tears streaming down her face. With one final guttural roar, the shadow exploded into a cloud of smoke. The air filled with the acrid scent of burning, and the church fell silent. Lucas collapsed onto the gurney, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Sophia knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she brushed the hair from his sweat-soaked forehead. Lucas, she whispered. His eyes opened slowly, their hazel depths free of the fear and darkness that had plagued them for so long. Thank you, he murmured, his voice weak but steady. Sophia sobbed with relief, pulling him into a gentle embrace. The following morning, the light of dawn streamed through the church's broken windows. The shadow was gone, and Lucas was alive, though he was still weak. The curse that had bound him to the mansion was broken. As the villagers gathered to offer their aid, Sophia looked toward the horizon. The mansion still loomed on the hill, a dark silhouette against the morning sky, but its grip on Lucas, and her, had finally been severed. Sophia took Lucas's hand in hers. We'll find a new home, she said, her voice soft but resolute. Somewhere safe. Somewhere far away. Lucas nodded, his small fingers tightening around hers. Together, they stepped into the light, leaving the shadows behind.